CEEY, a leading think tank in Mexico, is hosting the Social Mobility Summit 2016. Some of the world's main experts will come together to discuss and help establish a broad agenda for research and policy making. Follow us via live streaming at socialmobilitysummit.org.
So session 2 is about to begin. We have John Blanden, Bhash Mazumder, José Rodríguez Mora, Jan Stuhler, and the moderator will be Marcelo Delajara. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for welcome to session number 2. We have the pleasure to have 4 speakers, and I'm going to talk a little bit about them. To my right is Jo Blanden. She is Senior Lecturer in Economics and Research Director of the School of Economics at the University of Surrey. She has very recently become Principal Investigator on the 5-year project Delivering Better for Less, which seeks to understand how public sector productivity can be measured. Jo has worked extensively on intergenerational income mobility. Her work on changes in intergenerational mobility in Britain has been widely cited. We also have Bhash Mazumder. Bhash is a senior economist and research advisor at the Research Department of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. He also serves as the executive director of the Chicago Federal Statistical Research Data Center. Bhash research has been focused in 4 areas: intergenerational economic mobility, the long-term effects of poor health early in life, black-white gap in human capital development, and issues related to household financial well-being. Welcome. José V. Rodríguez Mora is professor of economics at the University of Edinburgh. Previously, he was professor at the University of Southampton and Universidad Pompeu Fabra. As a macroeconomist, his research interest in social mobility is centered in the allocation of human resources, political economy, and aspects related to labor market and welfare state. And we also have Jan Stuhler. Welcome, John. Jan is assistant professor in the Department of Economics at Universidad Carlos III in Madrid, and is further affiliated with the Swedish Institute for Social Research in Stockholm, ISA in Bonn, and the Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Group in Chicago. His main field of research are applied economics and labor economics, with a focus on 2 topics areas: migration and intergenerational mobility. So welcome 4 of you, and we'll start with Jo.
So this paper extends the literature on social mobility to investigate intergenerational links in home ownership. There's 2 reasons we're particularly interested in this, or maybe even 3. One is that home ownership is an important marker for wealth. So here are just some numbers that I pulled from different studies which tell you how much of a proportion of people's wealth comes from their principal residence. I'm not sure how comparable they are in terms of the methodologies used, but they're basically saying that coming up to 2/3 of individuals' wealth comes from their home ownership. So it seems an important way, if we want to try and get the intergenerational correlations of wealth, which is an under-researched topic, we might want to think about the role of home ownership there. The second reason we're interested in this is because there's been a lot of discussion in the UK about intergenerational fairness and how people from more recent cohorts have been disadvantaged in the labour market and in the housing market. And there's some very stark figures on this that a number of people have been talking about, showing how difficult it is for younger cohorts to actually get on the housing ladder. So here's some figures from the Survey of English Housing, which shows how the extent to which home ownership has declined among younger groups in the United Kingdom. Actually, this is England, because it's the Survey of English Housing, over recent years. So you can see a really sharp drop in home ownership among people under 30, and also a pretty sharp drop among people under 40 as well. Since the Great Recession, probably home ownership rates have gone down across the board, but this seems to have really fallen on the younger groups particularly, and these are groups who are also suffering in the labour market. Okay? So this is another reason we're interested in this. The third reason that we're interested in this is that we've had research in the past which has demonstrated that social mobility fell in the UK in terms of income measurements for particular cohorts. And these are quite nice data sources, and they also allow us to measure home ownership. So we thought that given the interest in wealth and given the interest in home ownership, it would be interesting to look at whether there were correlations in home ownership that mirrored those for income in the cohorts that we're interested in. I'm not going to give you any more preview on that. So we've already used information, from the English Housing Survey, which demonstrates this cohort pool. You can even see it even more starkly if you reorganise the data in a different way by cohort of birth. Okay. And we've also done some work which has tried, because there's always a problem in that you don't know whether it's the cohort you're born in or the age they happen to be or the time period that you happen to be measuring these things in. So we've tried to pull those results together as much as we can and account for cohort time and age effects. And when we do that, we really do see that more recent cohorts have been struggling to own their own homes in the United Kingdom. Taking this English Housing Survey data. I mean, obviously, when you start to get to the younger groups, it's pretty imprecise. It's quite difficult to know what's happening here. But given the 1958 cohort, which we're going to look at, seem to have a quite high home ownership rate, and that's really declined pretty monotonically since. And what this is basically telling us is that my cohort, 77, probably has about a 40% chance less of owning their own home, or 40 percentage points lower home ownership rate than somebody born in 1958. Okay? And our other cohort of interest is the 1970 cohort, because we're going to use those and look at intergenerational correlations, and there's clearly been a steep drop in the opportunities for home ownership between the 1958 and 1970 cohort in the UK. So we're going to use this cohort data. Sorry, I'm a bit thrown because I'd reorganised all of this. We're going to use this cohort data sets, the National Child Development Study of babies born in 1958 and the British cohort study of babies born in 1970. These both started with quite large observation sets, and they followed people periodically through their lives, collected a lot of data on their family background, and the UK mobility literature has really focused on considering correlations in income between these cohorts, across these cohorts between parents and children, and also correlations in social class, in big social class. And I think this might be something that Michelle has certainly worked on in the past. Now we're going to add information on housing tenure to our picture, and we're really going to focus on outcomes as measured at age 42. So for our most recent cohort, this is looking at home ownership in 2012. Okay, so this is quite recent. I mean, it's always a concern when you look at cohorts, and Anders actually alluded to this, that you're thinking about people who grew up really rather a long time ago. Okay, so is this really relevant? And I think that criticism is somewhat weakened here, because we're looking at, people's home ownership in their 40s. We're not really focusing on what happened to them when they were, growing up and going through the education system. We're talking about their home ownership now. Although, of course, we are relating it to the circumstances of their parents, which is one generation earlier. So when we look at this cohort data, we're going to initially consider the relationship between owning a home at age 42 and whether your parents own their own home at age 16. And what you see here is that there has been a drop in home ownership rates for people at age 42 between these cohorts, but that drop has been particularly marked for people whose parents didn't own their own home. Okay? So this is kind of all we need to see in some sense to tell us that intergenerational correlations in home ownership have increased between these two cohorts. Okay? So people whose parents didn't own their own home, 74% of them would have gone on to own their own home at age 42 in the 1958 cohort, and that fell to only 59% in the second cohort. Okay? Whereas the drops were there for people whose parents owned their own home, but they were much, much less marked. Okay? So we've done some regression results, which I won't talk in great length about, but what these basically show is that this is a pretty robust result, whether you measure parental income at age 10, parental home ownership, stuck in the past at age 10 or age 16, and that these results are quite robust. They're robust to different ways of measuring it if you're interested in this stuff. So we've just used linear probability models. If you use probits, it's the same. If you use logits and calculate odds ratios, it's basically a very similar story. We've also experimented with controlling for some things. I think a further way we want to push this work is to think about the mechanisms that might be driving it. One mechanism is clearly that people whose parents are homeowners are going to be better off. They're going to be able to bestow those advantages to their children. One way that manifests is through human capital accumulation. So we've just looked very quickly here at controlling for children's maths and reading scores when they're quite young, age 10, just to see how much of it is coming through that route. It is true that the home ownership correlation is weaker, but the change is very clear. Okay? So this isn't something about, you know, the second cohort is better off, there's more homeowners, and it's that being better off which is transmitting to the children's ability and human capital, and that's what's making the difference. It's something a little bit more direct than that. Now, it could still be coming through other education measures, and we need to look at that. Of course, the other thing we really want to look at is whether it's coming through inheritance or gifts from parents to children in terms of their actual ability to buy homes, independent of what their income level is. Okay? So we're going to look at that as well. I'm going to get us on time again. This is amazing. So when we look at these things, we really think that there's two contributions that we're making here. The first contribution that we're making is to think about this idea of intergenerational fairness in the UK, in particular this idea of fairness between younger and older cohorts in general, regardless of whether they're the parents and children. And this has been a particular concern in the UK because of these observations that have made that since the recession, it's been young people who have really missed out, and it's been young people who've not been able to get on the housing ladder. And we show that this disadvantage to younger cohorts is really falling on those whose parents didn't have a store of wealth in terms of their housing. And what we also show is that if you model home ownership at age 42 as a function of both parents' home ownership, parents' social class, and parents' income, it's home ownership that makes more difference. Okay, and that's, you know, we're comparing whether people's parents are home ownership with whether they're from a professional background or whether they're from a top income group, which should be pretty strong markers of their advantage, and we're actually finding that it's home ownership that matters more, although of course those two things matter as well. Although interestingly, social class shows a weakening impact on home ownership across these two cohorts, conditional on the other effects. And this also speaks to literature that I've been engaged with for a number of years, looking at the impact of all sorts of measures of parental background on children, and particularly the relationship between parental income and children's income in the UK, which seem to strengthen between these cohorts. Okay, so there seemed to be an indication that the family background you came from in terms of income was mattering more for where you ended up in life. Now, interestingly, that result wasn't echoed in the sociological literature, in particular the kind of big class literature, where basically it was seen that there was a completely flat relationship between social class across these two cohorts. And so it's quite interesting to see whether this home ownership can bring anything to that debate. I'll just show you a couple of results which confirm this. So we've just checked, you know, whether the income measures at 42 are saying this story, and you can see, I can't find the pointer either. So you can see that, you know what it is? Oh, yeah. I just wasn't pressing it. So you can see here that if we look at income, you can see there's a growth in the relationship between income, parents and children between these cohorts. We kind of do a slightly cheeky measure of social class, but I think it's okay. It's basically the weighted combination of different correlations between one social class, between people having the same social class across generations. I don't think it would make much difference, but that's flat, and we kind of already know that. But we've already seen that the home ownership stuff does go up. Okay? And this doesn't seem to be particularly influenced by the sample that we use. Okay. So we confirm these trends, and we think that we add something to that story. Okay. So home ownership, we think, is a good measure of wealth, and we think that the intergenerational relationship between wealth across generations was increasing at the same time as the intergenerational relationship of income. The other thing that we find that's quite interesting is that we can do these intergenerational housing associations within income groups and within social class groups. And when you do it within income group, you kind of see that it's part of, let's just make sure I've got the right one, that it's sort of part of the same phenomenon. Okay? So when you look across here, you do see that in the second cohort, your parental income group seems to matter more in terms of whether you end up owning your own home. Okay? So there's an increased gradient across the whole thing there. Okay? When you look within social class, though, the picture is rather different in that the strengthening relationship in home ownership is just as prominent within low social classes and high social classes. So and we kind of already know it's not driven by that, because otherwise we'd see it in the previous slide. So I think this is very interesting. We want to do more. We want to try and get perhaps a better measure of wealth from our housing data, looking at the size of homes and what they're worth, although I don't think the data on that's that great. And we also want to look a bit more about the transmission here. Is it part of the same phenomenon in terms of people from better off backgrounds end up earning more and more, able to buy their own homes through that route, or is there something going on with direct transmissions of housing wealth from parents to children, people downsizing and making capital available and those kind of things, which I think is really interesting in terms of the policy debate in the UK at the moment.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. We move to the second speaker, Bhash.
Okay, I'm very happy to be here. So I decided to sort of follow the session title and really just talk about what I think are a few relatively recent developments in the literature. My talk will be focused purely on the US. So I'm going to talk about four different things. Recent estimates of intergenerational mobility in the US. I'll talk about some evidence on changes over time in the US, which has been a really prominent topic in the political discussion. I'll talk a bit about subgroup differences, so differences in intergenerational mobility by race and also by ethnicity for between Hispanics and non-Hispanic whites and non-Hispanic blacks. And then finally, we heard a bit about this from Miles, but I'll go back to some of the work discussed earlier in the earlier session about geographic differences. And I'll talk about some new work that I'm doing related to that. Okay, so what do we know about US estimates of intergenerational mobility? I'd argue that, so for the most part, researchers until more recently, especially economists, have focused on income mobility, and in particular on this measure, the intergenerational income elasticity, which some of us refer to as a IGE, so if you see that in any of my slides, that's what I'm referring to. And for the most part, over the last decade or two, most of the research, I think, has been fairly consistent, especially when we focus in on a common measure, say family income in both generations. And I listed some of the sites here under the first bullet that some people in the room have even contributed to, and you typically get estimates of around 0.5 or higher. So one important recent development and really high profile work is the work done by Raj Chetty and Nathan Hendren and their co-authors. I want to make sure Nathan gets as much prominence as Raj because he's really been a big part of their work. And some of their other authors are interchangeable though. But a big part of their main focus of their research was on drawing these maps and showing the heterogeneity and intergenerational mobility across the US. But they did produce national estimates, and their national estimates were actually quite a bit lower than this consensus. So they estimated it at 3, 4, but they focus most of their work then on looking at rank-rank associations. Given how high profile that work was, I wrote a paper recently that just came out in the IZA journal, Research in Labor Economics, explain why I think their national estimates are flawed. And it's basically a limitation with the tax data that they currently have available. And I think you can kind of highlight it. I pulled one figure out of that paper. And the idea here is to basically argue that, from a long literature developed by Gary Solon, myself, and others, we've argued that really to estimate intergenerational mobility, you really need long panels of data covering the entire life cycle of both parents and kids. That gives you the ideal data set you want to estimate things. Now, of course, we're not always going to have that, and we have to sometimes make adjustments and show the direction in which biases might go if we don't have the complete life cycle. The Chetty et al. Paper is shown in the middle columns. This is basically the data structure they're using. They're using 2 years of children's earnings when they're age 30 or 31. These are the 1980 to 1982 birth cohorts observed in 2 years, 2011 and 12. And basically, parent income is measured over a range of years, but what I showed was for the mean parent age in their sample. This is the age of dads. They use a 5-year average of their parent income, and it's really focused a bit closer to age 50, I would argue, than we would like based on previous studies of measurement. And in the third set of columns, I'm showing you what I did in this IZA paper, where I basically used our tiny sample that you get in the PSID in the US. This is a sample of households started in 1968, where the PSID has continued through to this day. So we have approaching 50 years of data where we can link parents and kids, and maybe even parents, kids and their grandparents. And what I did for this exercise was simply use the midpoint of the life cycle and then use long-term averages. And basically the results you get out of that produce estimates that are in the range of 0.6 or higher. And I would argue that, and they're also in the range of a recent paper that David Grusky's a co-author on with Pablo Mitnick, where they also use tax data, but they have longer panels of tax data, so they could look at longer time averages of parents, and they could look at kids a little later in their life cycle, and they have a variety of different estimates of this IGE and produce estimates within the range of 0.55 and 0.74. So the first point I want to make is I think despite this kind of recent high-profile work using what we would think of as the best data, I would argue that the U.S. intergenerational elasticity is in the 0.5, 0.6 range, suggesting that intergenerational mobility in the U.S. is relatively low, and that dot on the Great Gatsby curve is where it should be, whereas if you thought that this recent work was correct, you would now put the U.S. back in the middle of the Great Gatsby curve. Okay, second thing I want to discuss is recent work on changes over time. So there's a second paper that Raj and Nathan and their co-authors wrote, which basically argued that there's been no change in intergenerational mobility and relative mobility. So this is a different concept than what David was talking about earlier in his new work. But basically argued that this hasn't changed over time. When this work first came out, I was reading The New Yorker and this column, and I was astounded because I read it kind of quickly and I thought, oh, they only have tax data going back to 1996, and this last sentence said, that even when they looked back to the 1950s, they had concluded that intergenerational mobility was relatively stable over the entire second half of the 20th century. So I had some trouble reconciling this, and there were plenty of headlines in the US of this flavor. So for the most part, I think we shifted from a debate where there were differing views on whether mobility had changed to, probably because of this influential paper, a more of a consensus view that mobility has not changed. And I want to kind of revisit that because I don't think that's quite correct. So this is some of the evidence that they showed in this second paper, and I would focus on these blue circles that start from 1971 out to 1982. And one key point to make sure of is that this is plotting the child's birth cohort, and these are showing dots of the income rank association when the child is age 30. So basically this is measuring by year of income in the labor market what the trend in intergenerational mobility has been from 2001 to 2012. And then there are these other things that try to extrapolate using younger ages or whether you attended college. I'm not going to focus on that. But the point I want to make is this is actually a very narrow slice for which to have argued it's changed over, there's been no change over the second half of the century. Most of where that is coming from is basically pasting this to another paper by Lee and Solon using an entirely different data set with different measures at different ages, which I'm not totally sold on in any case, but that's where you're getting the 50-year conclusion. This is really not showing you that. So how do we reconcile all of this? So I'm going to go back to a paper I wrote with my colleague Dan Aronson, where we use census data going back to 1940, the first year that income is measured. And we use this, what we call the synthetic cohort approach. It's not a perfect approach. Hopefully it qualifies in what David called earlier ingenious. But what we tried to do was match people in a given census by their birth year and their state of birth to a synthetic group of parents in an earlier census, and then we mapped out what the relationship with that income elasticity would be. And basically you see this pattern of improving mobility post-1940, relatively flat, and then an increase from 1980 to 1990. And this happens to line up extremely well with work by Claudia Golden and Larry Katz in their book that looked at education over the 20th century. And this lines up with a measure of the return to college. This is basically how much more would you have earned if you had 4 years of college versus not. And what I would argue is that the Chetty et al. Estimates that I showed you are really talking about these two data points. A data point I didn't have yet in my paper, and this is made up, but I have estimated this, and it's roughly flat when you use the American Community Survey for 2010. And I would argue what they're tacking it onto are some results from the PSID, but I would argue the nature of the PSID, because it started in 1968, the earliest cohort for whom you have a good reading of their income are people who were 17 in 1968, born in 1951, and if, like Anders and I, you really think we ought to measure income for the kids when they're age 40, 45, you're really not getting a good read on this 1951 cohort until you get till around 1990. But even if you're charitable and you look at some data here, it wouldn't line up with the trends that I estimated using the synthetic cohort approach. So I would argue what's being called no change in mobility over the last 50 years is really missing the key inflection point from 1980. So what would you need? Well, really what you'd need is data comparing labor market outcomes in the 1970s, say, to the 1990s, or thinking in terms of birth cohorts, something for like the 1940s birth cohorts to the 1960s birth cohorts. And in some work that I'm doing that's not yet written up but has been floating around a long time, I basically did this using two cohorts of what the Bureau of Labor Statistics have put together, the national longitudinal surveys. And these both allow you to construct intergenerational samples. The data is not always perfect. For example, in the NLSY 79, you don't get a lot of other information about the parents. You literally just know their income when they were living at home with the kids. But what you can do, and you can do this with various measures of mobility. Here what I've done is plotted the rank-rank association, where one measure of intergenerational association is the rank-rank slope, where a higher number is a lot like the elasticity. It means, you know, a 10 rank difference in the parent generation translates into a 0.4 or 0.2 rank difference in the kid generation. And what you see is if you use the NLS 66, these were cohorts born from 1945 to 1954, you see that the slope is a lot flatter. It's a slope of about 0.25, and when you get to the NLSY 79, where cohorts were born from 1957 to 1965, and their earnings are observed past the increase in the return to education in the 1990s, you have a much steeper slope of around 0.4. What do these numbers mean? Well, if you go back to that map that Miles showed you from Raj and Nathan's work, this would be the equivalent of moving from 0.26 to 0.4, of moving from the 40th ranked city to the 338th ranked city. So this has been quite, I would argue, a large change in intergenerational mobility over that same period that you see this kink using the census data. And in the spirit of Anders is pointing to the role of family background more broadly, in earlier work with David Levine, we looked at brother-brother correlations and sister-sister, et cetera. But I'm showing you the brother correlation in a variety of measures using those same NLS cohorts, where again, one is largely measured prior to the change in inequality around 1980, and one is measured post, and you see the brother correlations rising. So it's not just a parent-to-child income association, but the larger family background associations have changed. And again, it's at the same period of time in which the return to education has sharply moved. So overall, I would argue, I think, none of this is purely definitive either. There are assumptions going on, but the idea that there's now a consensus really based on having tax data where you've covered cohorts back to 1970 and you've really looked in the 2000s, I think is a mistake. So hopefully as we get new and better data sources, we'll be able to re-examine this, but I think going backwards in time, we're never gonna have the magical data. I mean, even connecting the 10-year censuses, we're gonna have to make some assumptions about how transitory income in a particular year is and what age it's measured at, et cetera. Okay, so the third thing I want to talk about is race and ethnic differences in the US. So first I want to show you some work I've done comparing racial differences between blacks and whites. Here I've used two different surveys, and let me walk you through what this figure shows. Along the x-axis, I'm using sort of a cumulative bins of the percentile range of the parent income distribution. So for example, the second point that's 1 to 20 is basically saying of families who started in the bottom quintile, I'm now going to ask what's their probability of exceeding the bottom quintile in the child generation. For whites, that number is about 75%. For African American black families, it's about 50%. It's about a 25 percentage point difference, and you see that that difference is stable across the lower half of the income distribution, and it doesn't matter all that much whether you use survey data or whether you use this data, which is survey data linked to administrative earnings data. You get this pretty stark differences in the probability of moving up out of the bottom of the income distribution. An important point was made earlier, I think it was Miles, but I'm not sure, that it's just when you look at rags to riches, something must be going on at the top. And so I think this is a relatively understudied area to look at downward movements, but here I've plotted kind of the same things, looking first at the top decile of the income distribution, and then cumulatively expanding it to the top half of the income distribution. And now you see the blue line is lower than the red line. So whites actually have less downward mobility. So in a sense, whites are advantaged on both fronts. They have greater upward mobility and less downward mobility than blacks. Here the gaps aren't quite as big but are still quite striking, which suggests that part of the story of racial gaps and intergenerational mobility is also about the inability to maintain high status among African Americans. And I think this may be tied into the work Joe was talking about in terms of home ownership. In current work that I'm looking at is tracing the historical impediments to blacks owning their own home, and that might be an important reason why black mobility is lower. Okay, or in this case, downward mobility is higher. Okay. This is from new work that I'm doing. It's not a very pretty chart yet, but we're for the first time, I believe, looking at Hispanics in the US. And here we're plotting the rank-rank association, and you know, if you ignore the dots and just focus on the slopes, the dots are what are kind of the noisy measure you get for every single centile in the income distribution. But the slope for the red line is, the colors are a little awkward for like the dark, more magenta-ish line is really, should think of this as whites. It's including some Asians and some other non-black, non-Hispanics. But essentially you see that no matter where you start in the parent income distribution, your expected rank is going to be higher if you're white. And the red line that's at the bottom is for blacks. No matter where you start in the income distribution, your expected rank is going to be lower for blacks. And Hispanics fall somewhere in between that, a bit closer to blacks. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about is some results on geographic differences, which you know, Miles had already discussed, so I won't go into a lot of detail. But this is showing one of the maps in the Chetty et al. Paper that focuses on the rank-rank slope and shows you this idea that you see a lot of red, which is the low mobility places along the south, and you have areas of higher mobility scattered around. One key point I want to make is that I think this exaggerates the amount of low mobility in the South. There are lots of commuting zones in the South with low mobility, but that are not as populated as some of the areas that might have higher mobility, so that when you aggregate this up to the regional level, it is true the South has less mobility, but not all that much different from, say, the industrial Midwest. They're actually pretty comparable, and not as starkly looking differences with the Northeast and the West. So one point, since we were recently past the election season, when Raj and Nathan present this, they sometimes like to show this difference between Pennsylvania over here and Ohio, where you have two bordering states, and Pennsylvania appears to be a place with relatively rapid mobility, and Ohio not so much. I thought this would be nice after the election because the expectation was that Hillary Clinton was going to nicely win Pennsylvania, and the polls showed Ohio more of a toss-up, but likely to go to Trump. As it turns out, Hillary lost both of them. But if you look at the share of the votes, the gap was almost negligible in Pennsylvania and about 10 percentage points in Ohio. So there might be something there in terms of factors like social capital, degree of segregation. There are a lot of factors that those guys talk about in explaining this map, and they might be related to some of the political results we've seen. What I do want to do just very quickly in my last slide is basically combine one thing that you can't get out of tax data is know an awful lot about, you don't really know the demographics of these people. So a common thought is how much of this is driven by blacks living in the South. And Chetty and Hendren and Klein and Saez basically argue it's not driven by blacks, because if they focus just on white areas, you see the same pattern. But the point is that actually disguises a really interesting thing, which is that black mobility is actually higher in the South. And you wouldn't know that because you only have the administrative data. So there's a real value in having both administrative and survey data to tease out some of these interesting things. So this is work I'm doing with the NLSY 79, where I can't get to the commuting zone level, but I've broken up the country into 9 geographic regions. And the overall map is fairly consistent with what Chetty et al. Showed, and you see that the Northeast and Midwest isn't actually all that different from parts of the South once you aggregate it up. But you see that this map looks a lot more like the map for whites than it does for blacks. For blacks, you actually see relatively rapid mobility in the South, say, compared to other parts of the country. And in fact, some of the deep South states show some of the most rapid intergenerational mobility. And I think there's a really interesting story there I don't have time to talk about, but a lot of great things were happening in the South during the 1960s and the Civil Rights era that we only now know about and is reflected in intergenerational mobility estimates. So I'll wrap up here just in summarize. So I think the best estimates still suggest intergenerational mobility in the US is relatively low. I think there's reasonably good evidence of a decline in mobility over the second half of the 20th century, but you really need data of the right cohorts in the right time period to capture that. Blacks are disadvantaged both with respect to upward and downward mobility. And in fact, if you think of a transition model and extrapolate these trends going forward, this would imply no further progress in racial income gaps in the US. So it's a pretty sobering combination of results. I'm hopeful that that won't hold, but we'll see. And Hispanics fall between whites and blacks, and I'm hoping to explore that more in future work. There are sharp geographic differences, but they differ importantly in the US by race, ethnicity, and other factors that I think we're only beginning to explore. So I'll stop with that.
Thanks so much for inviting me to be here. It's more than a pleasure. It's a delight. So I didn't know what to present. Most of the things I work are theory. So I'm going to talk mostly about a paper which is empirical, it's actually more than empirical, it's only data, and looking at moments, but on the way I talk about other things. So some of you have seen this paper. It has a lot to do with what Miles said before. Actually, we do what he was suggesting. So we look at a country, a very homogeneous country from the point of view of institutions, but very heterogeneous from the point of view of society, of economics. And then we look at how mobility is, and then we correlate it with things. And the country is Italy. These correlations are not obvious. We find exactly the same that Chetty et al. Find, but it's different than what Clark finds, which is that they correlate with nothing. You do it using surnames. We have been working in surnames for a long time. We use surnames in a very different manner. And one of the points of this is to show that when you make a judicious use of surnames, you get results that are like everybody else seems to get. There is nothing specific. It's just how you do it, I guess. Now, later we talk about what are the specific things. Our approach is we use surnames differently. We use a cross section of society. We don't use a panel. And the closest thing that I can think of is to use sibling correlations. With a sibling correlation, you oh, sure. I was pointing here. You can get knowing the ratio of conditional to unconditional variance tells you what is the correlation, what is the parental correlation. So how can you do it? Because siblings carry things together. They have things that come from their parents if their outcomes are very similar, is because the things that they come with their parents are important. In a sense, we extract information from the imprint that mobility leaves on the cross-section of society. It's not dissimilar to taking a picture of a car moving, and the faster the picture is moved, it implies that the car is moving faster. The more that the picture is blurry, but it implies that the car has been moving faster. So we have a previous paper that many of you know, in which we developed the methodology to doing this. We generate a moment of the data that we call the informational content of surnames, which essentially tells you how much you know about a person by knowing his surname and nothing else. How much of the variance of whatever in that paper was education or income in this paper, you know by knowing the surname of this person. And this moment of the data has properties which are interesting. One of them is that it monotonously moves with raw, with the correlations that we typically talk about. And it's a robust measure. This relation is kind of robust. And then what we are going to do is, instead of measuring raw, which is complicated, we can do it, you can do it using the surnames, but for that you need a model, and you have to calibrate the model to the data to get it. We do that in the previous paper. In this one, we don't do it. We just take the ICS and use it as a proxy for raw. Then we correlate it with things, and we try to learn from this. In that previous paper, we show several interesting things that I mentioned because it has to do with the discussion that we had before. We show that the evolution over time of the informational content of surnames mimics, actually is exactly the same that the one of the sibling correlation. We do this with Spanish data. Now, then we also saw that there is a secular decrease in mobility during a period of 2 generations, and this decrease in mobility was anticipated 1 generation before by an increase in the degree of assortative mating, which kind of suggests that these 2 things may have to do in common. That the increase in assortative mating that happened 1 generation before caused the decrease in mobility later. In the current paper, we won't look at time, but we will look at regions, and we will look at how things correlate across regions, following Miles' intellectual lead. Surnames in Italy they follow the standard Western conversion, and they are very useful it's easy to use them for this. And the distribution of surnames is very homogeneous across Italian provinces, which allow us, particularly when you look at tails of the distribution, has to do with relatively uncommon surnames. And this allows us to make the comparisons relatively easy. We do with different measures, with different degree of frequency of surnames for using it. In all of them, we get essentially the same results. This is on one hand. On the other hand, the other advantage of Italy is that it's a very heterogeneous country from the point of view of outcomes. The difference per capita between the rich and the poor, the richer and the poorest regions, provinces in Italy is the same that between Hungary and Luxembourg, which are among the poorest and the richest countries in the European Union, and etc. Well, now, we use the Italian records for the Italian tax records for 2005, which refers to 2004 taxes. This is because actually the reason why we do Italy, I confess, this was a lie. The reason we use Italy is because we have the data for Italy, and you know, as somebody said before, The future of this business, I am convinced, is in administrative and what they call big data. This is what is going to be, what we are going to be talking eventually. For history things, perhaps funny things like the ones we use with surnames could have some importance, but in the future what we will be doing is administrative data. I talk about Italian administrative data in a second, with using the standard correlations, using the Chetty et al. Thing. But this is just with the cross-section, because it's the thing that we had, and the reason we had it is because for some very complex Italian things, this data was public in the web during 3 days. Somebody downloaded, and then they sell it, and then we bought it. Okay, so now this is surnames distributions. Let me go to thing. So the thing, for each province, we calculate the informational content of surnames, and then we get that surname, which is our proxy for mobility, or for lack of mobility. And they vary a lot, and this is your map for Italy. It has a but, and I will come to this. You see the south of Italy, dark means less mobility, less dark means more mobility. There is a point there. This is the German-speaking areas. I come to that. We don't measure ethnicity well. That's why this happens. I come to that. Now, now, for comparing it, how our measure does with other things, there is recently Gianluca Violante and some other people that I don't personally know. They just got Italian administrative data. This is not a paper yet, but in Gianluca's webpage you can see the slides. They just got administrative data for Italy, and they can do the Chetty thing actually with more years for the young. They have been very kind, and they have shared with us the results. Of course, not the original data. They can do it because one of these two guys, I forgot whom, is the owner of the tax records in Italy, works in the tax authorities. In any case, so and then what we do is to correlate our results with them. They get the same map, if you want, and our correlations are very, very large. The only thing that is different is that these things for them is clear, it's not dark. And this is because I think that we are doing something wrong in measuring ethnicity or something of that sort. But that's the only difference. Otherwise, the map looks exactly the same. Their map. You can see the thing. Now, what we do is to correlate this. So this, by the way, it's a strong evidence for me, and this makes me very happy, that using surnames in this way gives you the same thing that everybody else. And seems not completely crazy. Now, then what we do is once we have that map, we correlate it with everything that we have found that exists at provincial level in Italy, and then we try to learn from there what it tells. If it tells us something, these are things with which we correlate it to. And then this is our results, I guess. This is the things. This is a table with the things that one of the referees thinks, and I agree, particularly if you are one of the referees is here. I particularly agree in that case. No, that they are the key variables to which we should correlate it. Which are economic activity, which is a measure of GDP or whatever, inequality, schooling or lack of, and I come to that, and social capital. This is because these are the things that Chetty et al. Do and find, and we find the same correlations that they do. This means that, so the first column, by the way, is without controls. The second one is controlling. I don't know if I have explained it myself clear. This is for all the our unit of data now. It's a province. Now this says that to have it's very correlated to have high mobility and to be rich. The second one, it says that it is very correlated to have a high mobility and to have a very a very equal society. The schooling ones, in Italy, education is a central government policy. And the policy is the same everywhere. If anything, in areas that are poor, they put more resources. But this doesn't talk about how kids perform in the school and how kids do things in these schools and so on. And what I find is that, or how often do kids go to school, or if they do secondary education or not, or whatever. And in the areas where kids go to school and in the areas in which kids do better in school are the areas that have higher mobility. Then for social capital, we find that areas with more social capital, voter turnover, how many people read newspapers, etc., 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 these are areas with more mobility too. These are just correlations, there is no causality here. The other columns are controlling for things. We control for north and south, because we control for migration flows. We we control, except for, of course, for income, we control for value added, and the same thing essentially survives. These are the heat maps of the previous thing that I guess you cannot see, but if you have superpowers, you could see that, but it's that correlations, but in these maps. But not everybody does maps now with colors, and I was jealous when I saw Miles. I thought, well, but I will have colors, right? Unfortunately, I only have one. So in the next version, I will put more colors. So then then what we did was everything that we have, and then if you put good economic outcomes, and this is positively correlated with mobility. It's negatively correlated with ICS, which is something like the correlation, if you want. Bad economic outcomes, it's a low mobility. Then this I already said, this is value added. As you see, it's kind of something with the north, because with surnames have a lot of ethnic information too. They don't only talk about your parents, they also talk about the ethnicity and whatever. And that's why I think we are doing there is something that we don't pick up there. Now, this is for, so this is just, actually I could jump. So this is the correlations, and this is the p-value. If they are on the left on here, on the left of this line, it means that they are statistically significant, and this means good economic outcomes are negatively correlated with the ICS and are very significant. Bad economic outcomes are here, and so are very correlated, but very positively correlated and significant, and this is inequality. We also find, so this is Miles, I don't know why they call it the Great Gatsby curve, which confuses me. Really, I think it's a really bad name, I don't understand.
It was a competition.
But it was won by the loser, I don't understand. It makes no sense. But they should call it the Miles-Korak curve or something. No? Okay, so I don't know if they called you the Great Gatsby.
Trying to move on.
Okay. So this is the Great Gatsby curve for the Italian provinces. Again, there is the same tax structure, the same redistribution thing. Italy is a very centralized country in spite of its differences in outcomes. But there you have it. And then I find very interesting that when we put it with sociological things, the only thing that systematically matters, quote unquote, or for meaning it correlates with mobility, is these social capital things. The other things are all over. Some of them are not significant, others are, some of them here, others there. The only thing that systematically is the social capital, which is here, is correlated to having mobility. And I don't know why, but it's food for thought. I am mostly a theorist, so try to think with these things. And then we do a zillion of robustness checks, And can you press the arrow which is on the top? I don't have a mouse. No, the other one. Yeah, the one on the left. No, the one on the right. Sorry, I don't see. Yes, 1 second. Yes, perfect. So now I really have no idea of how I'm on time. I have 5 minutes, and I arrived to the conclusions. Okay. I'm going to talk very slow. No, I will talk about something else. But so we have provided this measure. I think that we should not be obsessive. We were talking before on coffee. We should not be obsessive about the measure of mobility. Meaning, we should not be obsessive if the rho is 0.2 or the rho is 0.7. We should be obsessive to compare alike with alike. And measuring in a certain way, there are 2 places, one which is 0.2 and 0.3. Perhaps measured in another way, these 2 places are 0.7 and 0.8. In order to understand what this means, we need to correlate it with other things, or to have a theory that allows us to think on these numbers. Otherwise, the numbers per se say little. We use this ICS. It is very correlated, as I said, with the standard measures. But of course, it doesn't say the same number. The ICS actually are very low numbers. Very, very low numbers. Point is that they correlate well with the quote-unquote standard errors, numbers, and they correlate in an interesting way, which is the same way that the other numbers seem to correlate with outcomes. And I think that we should think in that way. Now, and we see that in a country which is very homogeneous from the point of view of policies, we find the same, very similar correlations that we find across countries. So, albeit the difference between the US and Sweden is very large, it's probably not only because of tax and redistributions, and it's probably not only because of the very different education systems. Probably there are other things. The thing of the social capital really blows my mind. The fact that people is interested in politics, people that is proactive about things, of course it's not a cause, but it's correlated with these things. Perhaps they are that because there is more mobility, I really don't know. But these are the things that I think we should be striving to understand. Things that we are working on, I think that a critical aspect for the whole thing, and it was pointed before by somebody, a critical aspect of the whole thing is migration, I believe. We have a project looking with the whole history of US censuses, trying to understand how intergenerational mobility and geographical mobility dance with each other. On one hand, I can think that a large bit of international mobility arises from the possibility of people to move geographically, or the lack thereof. And an interesting exercise will be if you build walls, and this could affect mobility. And an interesting exercise will be to have some sort of structural model in which we could make the intellectual exercise of building these walls and see what effects this could have. So we're trying, that's complicated, and I don't dare to present anything on that yet. And the second bit is that, but also the prospects of mobility shape migration. If I am in an area where I am very stuck in my social position, I may want to move, but I'm not going to move to an area, I guess. I'm not going to move to an area where people is stuck in their social positions. I'm going to try to move to another one. So social mobility should or could also affect the patterns of geographic mobility within and across countries. And that's another aspect of things that we are trying to look at. Okay.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. So this has been a great session so far, a great 2 sessions so far. And I hope I can connect to some of the points that have been made before. So the session title is Recent Findings, and I have to excuse myself. This is actually a project I've been working on for some years. Some here on the podium have seen it before. Academic publishing is slow, and so I kept working on it, and so there's some new stuff. And in that sense, I think this is a good time to present this again, and also to present these new things that we've been working on. So what is this about? So as you will have seen, there's a large literature trying to find out what happens to intergenerational mobility over time. Okay, so this literature on intergenerational mobility trends. I put some of the citations here up from the literature in the US and UK, which is large, but we already heard there's much other work, and there's of course also much other work in other countries. Okay, and in that literature there are lots of empirical problems. There are problems about measurement. We heard from David Grusky that one big challenge is to get better estimates. We heard from Bhash Mazumder that even the evidence that we have might have been misinterpreted. And at the end of the day, even for countries such as the US, where there's a lot of interest in what happens to mobility over time, we might not have such great evidence. Okay, but I think there's a second question, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, is on how we should interpret the evidence. Okay, so what does it mean when intergenerational mobility goes down, for example? What does it tell us potentially about changes in the recent economic structure of our society? So one reason why that is a difficult question is because the existing theoretical literature that we have is not really that well suited in most cases to answer that question. So why is that? That's because the theoretical literature, they typically focus on some sort of hypothetical period in the future, and the mobility level that we would have in this distant future if the current institutions would just be there for a long time. Okay? And that's not the sort of perspective that we need to sort of interpret trends in intergenerational mobility over time. There are some exceptions. One is a paper by José V, for example, where he specifically looks at sort of the dynamics of intergenerational mobility across generations, but these sort of papers are rare. So what we did in this paper is we want to look at sort of the dynamic dynamic development of intergenerational mobility over generations and cohorts. Okay? And what I'm going to try to convince you is that that's an interesting question. First of all, because these sort of dynamics can be complex, but also because these sort of developments can be long-lasting over many generations, so for a very long time. Okay? So what is the basic idea? So I have some slides here where I also try to make the idea using formulas. So this paper is more a theoretical paper. So this is my attempt to kind of break it down and just to explain what the basic idea is without boring you with too many formulas. So the idea is this, that somehow the level of intergenerational mobility that we have, that on the one hand that might relate to sort of the institutions and the policies that we have, right? So Sevi was just talking about it, that somehow maybe in a country, variation in mobility across different areas of a country might also relate to differences in institutions. On the other hand, what should also play a role is the distribution of sort of outcome variables that we care about, such as income, education, other characteristics in the parent generation. So why is that? Well, one example is maybe in a society where those parents that have high income also have high education, high abilities, and high wealth. In other words, where all the different types of advantages that we can think about are all concentrated in the same type of families. So this will probably be a society where mobility tends to be low. Okay, so not only the current structure of the society matters, it also matters what are the distribution of variables such as income in the parent generation. Okay, but of course the idea is that these distributions among parents, that can be a function of past events and past institutions. Okay, so a very simple example is that it might somehow matter how much education your parents have, but of course how much education your parents have might relate to the school system that your parents were exposed to when they grew up. Okay, so you kind of get this idea that when you have some sort of structural changes or some policy reforms, that affects not only one generation, that potentially affects multiple generations after another. Okay, and that's perhaps an interesting perspective to interpret trends in intergenerational mobility. Okay, so you can write that down as equations, but I think I'm going to just skip over that, hoping that you got the main point that we want to make here. So you can just look at these intergenerational elasticities. For example, you can write down some sort of theoretical setup, and you can make this argument that I just made formally, and you get all sort of interesting implications from that sort of analysis. Okay, but what I would like to convince you is that this sort of thinking that it might somehow matter in terms of how we interpret trends in intergenerational mobility over time. And I want to do this in terms of two cases. Okay, so first I want to talk a bit more about the Great Gatsby curve, which we heard about before in many of the previous presentations. So that's going to be more of a theoretical exercise. So I want to show you what could happen if we take sort of these dynamics into account in this relationship between inequality and mobility. But of course, one can talk a lot about theoretical ideas, and that wouldn't be really convincing that this is something that happens in practice. So the second example that I want to show you is with actual data, and it is on a compulsory school reform that happened in Sweden. What we want to do is to show that this one reform had actually effects on intergenerational mobility, not only in the directly affected generation, but that you have repeated changes in mobility because of the same reform that happened in the past. So let's start with the Great Gatsby curve. So again, it's the same graph actually, so that makes it easy because you've already seen it and you've already understood it. So on the x-axis, we have just these different measures of income inequality across countries. On the y-axis, we have a measure of how much persistence there is in income from one generation to the next. And that again here is this intergenerational income elasticity. Okay, and we've seen that this sort of curve, you can also have it within countries. And I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of interest in what might sort of explain this relationship between cross-section inequality and intergenerational mobility, or the lack of intergenerational mobility between generations. Okay? So apart from the problem that, of course, we don't know if this relationship is causal or not, so people try to sort of put some interpretation of what this figure, for example, could mean for us. And one I think influential interpretation is the one that has been offered by Alan Kruger, who is chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. So this is something he said in 2012, but he has made a similar point again recently. Okay, so his point is to say that, well, if you see this graph and you know that cross-sectional income inequality has been increasing in the US in recent decades, okay, so that means that the United States has been going more towards the right in this figure, then perhaps we should also expect that the intergenerational income elasticity is increasing. And we should perhaps expect that we have less and less intergenerational mobility in future cohorts. Okay? So what we did in the study now is to think about, within the sort of theoretical framework that we've been working on anyways, to think about what might happen when you have such increase in cross-sectional inequality. Okay, and so specifically one thing that we try to do is to think about one of the underlying causes of rising cross-sectional inequality, and that is a rise in skill premia. Okay, so this idea that the more qualified, the more highly educated individuals, they somehow profit because the returns to those skills have been increasing over time. Okay, so that's one topic that has received a lot of interest in the literature, because if you work in a sort of standard theoretical model, as for example in the one used by Sola in 2004, then when you have a rise in skill returns, you will have increase in cross-section inequality, and you will have a decrease in intergenerational mobility. Okay, so this is exactly the sort of relationships that could motivate the interpretation that Alan Kruger has offered of this particular curve. Okay? But on the other hand, some of the empirical literature is conflicting. Okay, so there's some papers, the ones I think that are most cited so far are the ones by Lee and Solon and by Chetty, Hendren, and others. And so they argue that mobility appears to have been stable. We've already seen this is also an empirical question, right? So there are many difficulties, and this might not be exactly the answer, the complete answer. But at least that's at the moment, I think you called it a consensus view, where we stand. Okay? But one thing to keep in mind here is that when you have these sort of mechanisms in mind, for example, between rising skill premia and what you would expect to happen in the Great Gatsby curve, what you should think about are sort of more these transitional dynamics, and these dynamics can be complex. Okay, so just to give you an example, what happens within our model. So here we have two hypothetical countries. Okay, so the labels are a bit hard to understand, but I'm going to go through to make sure that you do understand. So the x-axis and y-axis are essentially as in the Great Gatsby curve. So on the y-axis, we have here a measure of the intergenerational elasticity. On the y-axis, we have a measure of cross-section inequality. In this particular case, what we chose is the average of the income variance in an offspring and a parent generation. Okay? And then we have these two different countries. So in our setup, they are characterized by different underlying parameters which reflect underlying different institutions. Okay? So think about them as maybe the US with high inequality and perhaps another country with lower inequality and more intergenerational mobility. So now what we do is we kind of simulate this change in skill premia. Okay? This idea that somehow the returns to skill go up in both of these countries in a similar way. And we see what happens to the intergenerational elasticity and to this measure of cross-section inequality in the next generations. Okay? So the pattern that we see here is, for example, this one. So if you look at country A, so the solid line here is intergenerational elasticity. So in the first affected generation, it goes up. But then if you look one generation later, in the subsequent generation, intergenerational elasticity starts again to decline until it eventually enters what we would call here like a new steady state. So that's this very long-run perspective that the traditional literature, that the literature usually has. If instead you look at the intergenerational correlation, okay, so we saw some papers that looked at this alternative mobility measure before, you would get a different pattern because this measure controls different for changes in cross-section inequality, but you also get these sort of dynamics. Okay, so in that case, you would get a decline in the intergenerational correlation with first affected generation and a subsequent increase. Okay? Now, these sort of dynamics can look somewhat different depending on sort of the parameters that you feed these different models with. So you see in country B, we actually, we might even have in the long run a decline in the intergenerational elasticity. So you can produce such sort of results in a model that is a bit richer than the standard models. But what the big takeaway is here is that these dynamics can be complex, okay? And they can be last across multiple generations. So when you have some expectations on how cross-section inequality and intergenerational mobility should move, I think it's interesting to keep in mind that we talk about these sort of transition processes across multiple generations, and also the consequences of reforms and institutional changes that can also be seen in trends in intergenerational mobility across multiple generations. So that was all theoretical. That might or might not be convincing. You can produce lots of things in a theoretical model. So what I want to show you next is an empirical case. Maybe an empirical case that is not that interesting per se as I think this discussion about the Great Gatsby curve, but that has a great advantage that we have very good data and that we can actually really track what happens to mobility across multiple generations. Okay, so I've said all of this. Maybe one last thing, because we had this discussion on if intergenerational mobility has been going up or down in the US. So even given our argument that there are these transitional dynamics, we think, so usually what we find is that the intergenerational elasticity should go up in the first affected generation. So I'm very sympathetic with this argument that it's a bit of a puzzle that we haven't seen this uptick in some of the evidence on intergenerational mobility trends in the US. Okay, so let's look at this more empirical application to show that this is really something that happens across multiple generations. So the sort of objective that we have here is somewhat demanding because we want to identify the effect of a particular institutional reform or policy change across multiple generations, right? And we want to isolate the effect of that particular reform from all the many other changes in the environment, in the economic environment that of course happen across generations. And I think one very interesting case here that can be made, one very interesting case that we can look at is the Swedish compulsory school reform. Okay, so what this reform did is to extend compulsory schooling to 9 years and postpone tracking decisions, and it was implemented for birth cohorts born from the early 1940s in Sweden. Okay. So that's an interesting reform in itself, because when we talk about intergenerational mobility, we typically are also interested in the education system, because we think this is one of the components that might matter a lot. But this reform is also interesting from an empirical point of view, because it was gradually implemented across municipalities, which greatly simplifies to analyze what the effect of that reform has been. Okay? And in that sense, because of that, we are not the first ones to study this reform, but we are the first ones to focus on sort of this dynamic aspect, what happens to intergenerational mobility across multiple generations. Okay? Finally, we have, in Sweden, you have very good data, so we have this data from multi-generational registers across multiple generations. So this is a graph just to kind of give you an idea of what's going on in terms of this reform. So these on the x-axis are different birth cohorts in Sweden. And this gray area here is the share of people born in any of these cohorts who have been subject to the new school type. Okay, so you see if you've been born in 1940, then you were not directly affected by this reform. If you're born later on, then with some probability, you are in one of the municipalities that has already been introducing this reform. Okay? By 1955 or 56, all of the municipalities have introduced the reform. So now what is the black area here? So the black area is when you go far enough to the later cohorts, eventually you have people being born to parents who were themselves already subject to the school reform. Okay, so if you look at people in 1960, all of the parents, in this case we're looking at fathers, went to the old school type, so they were not directly subject to the reform. But then over time, of course, also some of the parents, they have already experienced this school reform and this reformed school type. Okay, and maybe one interesting thing here is that the gradient of this black area is much flatter. Of course, it takes much longer time until every parent has been in the new school type, and that relates to the idea that there's variation in at what age people get their children. Okay, so it takes a long time until these sort of changes filter completely to the next generation. So now what we look in the study is both educational and income mobility. Income mobility, I think, is perhaps a bit more interesting. Educational mobility has a great advantage that's much easier to measure. Okay, so I'm going to show you some evidence on educational mobility, and you have to take my word that we find similar things in income mobility. So this is a measure of educational mobility, specifically for each cohort. So again, we do a separate analysis for each birth cohort in Sweden. And what we do is we regress sort of the years of schooling that one of these offspring born in one of these cohorts has on the years of schooling that a parent, on this case, it does not make much difference, in this case, their father has. Okay, and that gives you, for each birth cohort, gives you one coefficient. And so the first thing I want to emphasize here is that this coefficient drops quite steeply in this period where the reform was being implemented. Okay, so if you overlay these two things, I showed you this gray area. So this is the period where the reform was being implemented, and this is also the period where the schooling coefficient drops quite significantly. Okay? So what does it mean, this drop in this coefficient? It means that differences in schooling among parents are now being less strongly transmitted to the next generation. Okay? Now, this is just overlaying these two trends. There might be many different things that explain this. So what we do in the paper is that with some sort of empirical methods, we try to make the argument that it was really the reform that caused this decline in the educational coefficient. Okay, so if you're interested in that, please ask me. It's in the paper. But what we find is that indeed the reform was one of the strong determinants of this drop in the intergenerational education coefficient. You can see that a little bit. So I want to show that instead of showing you some sort of regression results or to show you some equations, you can see it in some sense in these sort of graphs. So these graphs, what you now have on the x-axis is if you've been born in a cohort before the reform was implemented in your municipality or after. Okay, so here the 1, for example, means this is the first cohort. So sorry, 0 is the first cohort after the reform was being implemented. This is the second cohort after the reform was being implemented. And we can look at different outcomes, for example, the share of offspring that have less than 9 years of schooling. And of course, you see when this reform is being implemented, the share drops significantly because that's what this reform was about, right? It was about making sure that everybody has a minimum number of years of schooling. Now you can do the same, you can look at average years of schooling. You can see that the variance of years of schooling shrinks when this reform is being implemented. And that's, of course, a lot of these sort of changes that we see here, they're just related to this compression that occurs because of the reform. Okay, so in that case, in that sense, it is a particular type of change that we track over generations, but one that had very strong effects. If you look at the schooling coefficient itself, you similarly see that with the implementation of the reform, you see a much steeper drop than in any of the other years. Okay, so that's sort of the graphical version of the evidence that we have in the paper, that indeed it was a reform that explained some of this decline. You can do the same for income. You see that the reform also had an effect on income mobility, and yeah. So that's the sort of direct effect of the reform, and that's something that people have looked at us before us. Now, of course, our argument is that the same reform might still have consequences on the trend in mobility that you see much later in time. Okay? And so our graph here goes onto the birth cohorts in the early 1970s. So after that, the data is just not allowing us to know that well anymore what the educational outcomes are. And what you see is that from the 1965 onwards, you start having an uptick again in these educational coefficients. Okay? And if you overlay that again with the graph that I showed you before, these are now, of course, exactly those cohorts where also some of the parents have been subject to this. Okay? Again, this is just overlaying trends. There might be many reasons for that, but we can do the same sort of empirical analysis, exploiting that this reform was being implemented at different places at different times, and we can find that there's indeed a causal effect. Okay? So the reform is one of the determinants of this increase in intergenerational education coefficient over time. Okay? So this is a somewhat straightforward example. What can happen? As I'm saying straightforward because in this case, what the reform has been doing, the sort of compression of schooling, it's pretty straightforward, right? But it allows us at least, because it's so straightforward, it allows us to show that these measures, these sort of intergenerational mobility measures that we typically look at, that that something can happen to them because of things that happened in the past. Okay, and that's I think an important takeaway. Okay, so let me just conclude. So sort of one conclusion here is that history matters. Okay, so what happens in the past matters also to understand the trends that we experience today. And if you want to sort of understand what happens today, on the one hand, you might want to look at what happened in the past, and also the way you think about intergenerational mobility might require somewhat of a dynamic perspective. Okay. So I gave you these two examples. One was a Swedish school reform. The other was within the Great Gatsby curve, a rising skill premium. I think, to be fair, you can think about many more interesting examples. Okay, you can, if you think about the country you're from, about some of the important structural changes that happened in the past, it's probably easy to see that some of these changes in the past, that they could still somehow have effects on how well different families do today. Okay, and I think it's interesting to look into that. It's interesting to look into that, so because it has many different implications. One is that if you have these institutional changes, you can generate long-lasting trends. It also means if we see some changes in mobility today, that these changes may be due to things that happened in the past. And you can go a little bit more into the details of what might happen or might not happen. For example, one thing that we show in the paper, but that I'm not going to show you today, so you have to read the paper if you're interested in it, is that you even can have these things that you can have a decline in mobility today, and that actually stems from something that happens in the past that in the long run is actually good for mobility. Okay, so you can get, by just looking at sort of temporary changes in mobility, you can get a very wrong picture of what the effects of reforms and institutional changes are on intergenerational mobility over time. Okay? I know there are some historians, some economic historians among us, so I think there's much more that can be learned about intergenerational mobility by also taking this sort of long run perspective.